Welcome to Wednesday, Secular Soapbox Day here at the Skeptic Haven Network. Today's topic is mythicism. Is Jesus the world's greatest myth? I'll be joined by my co-host, Apostacie, with special guest David FItzgerald, Reason to Doubt, Godless Engineer Oz, and Logan Daugherty. Start the show. All right, that was fun. Thanks for joining me today, guys. We got Apostacie. How you doing, Stacy? How's everything going?
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic.
Good.
Got ourselves a wonderful panel here today.
Yes, we sure do.
David FItzgerald, never met you. Thanks for coming on, man. Love the book. Great stuff. Godless Engineer. Oz. Jordan from the Reason to Doubt podcast. Good stuff. Listen to that a little bit today. Turin Shroud, all that fun stuff. Logan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Coming on. All right, so let's dive into this. Who's an expert on Jesus here? Who's seen him? Who's met him? Is he real? Does he live in your heart?
Yeah, I can't say I've met the guy. I've heard good things, but that's about it.
He always
Good
struck
and
me as
bad,
a little overrated.
Definitely overrated. I would have to admit on that one. Holy cow. Yeah. No, especially a sacrifice. What an overrated sacrifice.
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert. I'm just a guy that's read a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
That's always good. That makes me more knowledgeable than I am. I haven't read as much as you have, I'm sure. David, I'm still working on your book, man. It's good stuff, though. Lots in there. Tell us, why did you write that book? What brought that to mind?
You know what's funny about that? What's funny about that is 22 years ago, I guess, it never even crossed my mind to doubt whether there was a Jesus or not. And if I'd heard somebody like me saying what I've been saying for the last 20 plus years, I would have thought it was ridiculous, because there's nothing implausible about Jesus being a guy. And it's not like we'll stop being atheists if it turned out there was just a dude named Jesus, Right. Because every atheist I know says, oh, I know there wasn't, he wasn't the son of God, but of course there was a guy named Jesus, just like I did, for 16 years when I was an atheist. But the funny thing is, for me anyway, what happened was when I read through the Gospels and you see that all four Gospel writers who are supposed to be giving us biographies of Jesus are talking about four very different Jesuses. It made me wonder, well, which one's giving us the real story and which is just full of legendary bullshit that's been accreted later. So it was when I was trying to parse out what's the real Jesus from the fake Jesus, that's where my troubles began. And that's, long story short, 22 years later, I really don't think the guy existed at all. And no hyperbole, I don't think he existed at all. And I think early Christianity and the New Testament would look very differently, even if he was just a guy, just a dude.
Interesting. For sure, yeah, they've definitely got a couple different Jesuses in there. Jesus is Jesus.
Jesus.
All those Jesus in there. They're all different. So what about all the historical evidence, though? I mean, we got you got, what is it, the foreskin of Jesus, and you got the shroud of Turin. All these real things. Jesus was real. What do you say about all that?
Right. Seriously, I had a Christian on Facebook trying to. That was his checkmate atheist moment. Well, the Shroud of Turin. It's like, dude, are you kidding me?
You were talking to a
like,
Tangela?
We're not even the same.
Does his name start with an O?
Yes.
Was it? Oh my God, that's awesome.
It was. I think that's who it was. Yes. Yeah.
And that guy gets around.
He acted like that was his throwdown. It's like, boom.
Hello, my name is Otangelo.
Killed me. It's like, that is adorable.
Well, yeah, and, I mean, the
episode, right? On the Shroud. Reason to Doubt.
Again?
Shroud.
Yeah, we We did do a episode on the shroud. We want to do another one to kind of dig more into the evidence. But I mean, for me, and not this isn't an episode on the shroud, but for me, the fact that it was radiometrically dated. What more do you want? Like, but
boom, yeah.
But absolutely. Jesus. I mean,
absolutely.
But Jesus.
But Jesus. But reason.
So typically the evidence that people
or the other
to...
one kills me.
Oh, so go ahead, David.
No.
Love dead air.
You've got Zoom syndrome.
Go ahead, Godless.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, typically the evidence that is appealed to, as far as like people looking to establish a historical version of Jesus, it's not going to be physical evidence or anything like that, because Jesus didn't leave any physical evidence as far as we know. So we don't really expect to find things that that just simply aren't there. Like that's not the thing, that the linchpin and all of it. What we end up having to do is look at what was written about him, and what exactly people were believing about him, and what were the earliest sources saying about him. And I think that's where we kind of get into
and who were these earliest sources.
Yeah.
And how reliable are those early sources? Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a mistake some people make is they argue from the lack of physical evidence. But I mean, the simple fact is we don't have physical evidence for the vast and overwhelming majority of people who existed. Mm-hmm. And so that in and of itself isn't persuasive.
But here's the thing is, like, whenever they compare, if you throw out Jesus, you have to throw out everybody in ancient history. It's like, no, we just have to temper our provisional acceptance of events or people according to the evidence that we have for them. And Christian hyperbole regarding the state of evidence,
you've got
is ridiculous. It's like they say,
going robotic. I mean,
we may have lost him
on that. Almost. Like Vadi Bakum is a great example of somebody doing that, who argues that Jesus is better well attested than Julius Caesar and his conquest of the Gauls, which is just absurd. Yeah. But
I've heard it with Alexander the Great all the time. Right. All the time. Alexander the Great was a real person. Well, okay. What?
Well, yeah. I'll tell you exactly how we know Alexander the Great was a real person, and why we're doubting whether or not Jesus was. Alexander the Great had eyewitnesses. Now they're not extant, like those sources aren't extant to us today. Like we can't get our hands on them. But what we do have is Arrian's biography. Now, Arrian was writing about 400 years after Alexander the Great had died. But the thing is that he had access to these firsthand accounts. And the reason why we know, who these people were, why they were the best sources to give us information about Alexander the Great. And even Arrian even discusses how he resolves contradictions in his sources, and that's in he's got a whole section on discussing his sources. We know that he had two accounts from two of Alexander's generals, and we've also got multiple other sources as well that's mentioned by Arrian. And so we know that Alexander the Great was a real person, despite the best biography written about Alexander the Great being written 400 years later. And that's because Arrian at the time had access to real eyewitness accounts that, until you find evidence, to the contrary, that they were eyewitnesses. I mean, I don't see any reason, to doubt that they were eyewitnesses. So,
And that's just the textual evidence. It's like we've got physical evidence for him. We've got the brute,
the course of history,
fact that history could not have been what it was unless he really did these things. Yeah, exactly. Whereas for most of the things that you use to prop up somebody's historical claims, for most of those categories, Jesus has no evidence whatsoever. And the one that he does, textual evidence, is by false attributed eyewitnesses or non-eyewitnesses after the fact, telling a story because they want to sell you a religion, explicitly saying that. It's like, that's not the best kind of textual evidence. That's the worst kind of textual evidence.
So what you're saying is the gospel is not historical evidence for Jesus.
Which gospel? There's so many of them,
Well, I think it's a mistake to throw out the Gospels carte blanche as having any sort of historical value. Certainly, we can't just like read them and accept what it says without any kind of scrutiny, because if we did that, we'd all be Christians. So obviously, they're problematic. But if nothing else, if they are nothing else, they're books that were written by people who believed about things that they believed about in a point in history. And so that's why there's.
Let me stop you for a second there, because we'll say more about that. But
I was just saying, so
because I don't know.
It may not be the case. I don't think a priori you can just kind of throw them out because they were written by believers. You just have to take that into account when you're evaluating whether they can be trusted on something I say.
Well, I mean, I don't think that's what David was saying about the Gospels. I mean, the Gospels have been proven to be, historically unreliable. And that's where I'm regularly confused, because, scholars like Bart Ehrman, who, is propped up by people a lot, he's very confusing, because he seems to talk out of both of the sides of his mouth. Because on the one hand, he considers them, the Gospels, to be historically unreliable. But on the other hand, they're historically reliable enough to tell us even some of the smallest details about Jesus. And so it's kind of confusing.
He wrote a book of debate. They did a transcript of one of his debates not too long ago on, can we trust the New Testament on the historical Jesus? And it could have been me talking up there, because he and I were in lockstep agreement about, no, we can't trust the Gospels about Jesus. And there's many reasons for that. It's not just that we don't throw them out a priori. We throw them out because they all seem to be based on the first gospel, Mark, and Mark's gospel seems to be allegorical from start to finish. Those are just some of the reasons. I mean, the historical accounts of, say, Jesus' trial and execution make no sense whatsoever, historically, logically, even from a story plot standpoint. But they make perfect sense as an allegory. And we find that throughout the gospel.
And if I can add, I'll let Jordan go here in a second, because I know he's itching to get in on this. But I do want to add that there's substantial, strong evidence that suggests that whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark actually had Paul's epistles, and so he was using Paul's epistles to generate his gospel. So, I mean, honestly, the Gospel of Mark isn't even like an independent account, or an independently written thing. It was definitely dependent upon, like, at least Paul's gospel. But he did write it to be an allegorical thing. But I think that really the only independent source that you can rely on for, like, what we know about Jesus is Paul's epistles, his authentic epistles. Sorry, now let Jordan go.
Well, I think Paul would certainly be my preferred source in any particular instance, because he wrote earliest, and it was written by Paul, which is nice, as opposed to some guy we don't know. Unfortunately, Paul doesn't tell us a lot of the things we'd like to know about Jesus. I agree that the stories in the Gospels have a lot of legendary development to them, and so we have to be very careful about accepting one thing or another. But while I don't think we can say things like the transcript that we get of Jesus's conversation with Pontius Pilate, like, how would anybody have known that? Anybody who was there and still living to give their testimony wouldn't have been likely to talk to a Christian, right? So I don't think we can, there's good reason to doubt that the Gospels are giving us accurate information when it comes to that. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a crucifixion. It just means that we can't trust Mark when it comes to, like, what happened during the crucifixion, if that makes sense. So, I mean, if you get down to the base level of the claim being made, which is that Jesus was a religious prophet who preached a message of apocalypticism and faced the fate of most apocalyptic prophets of his time, being crucified, I mean, it doesn't seem like a big claim.
It doesn't seem like a big claim, but at the same time, I don't think that there's good criteria that's been put forth that would allow us to sift through like gospel information in order to get that kind of information. I've read the arguments from like Ehrman, who is one of the ones that does this a lot. He's regularly appealed to, but like for instance, one of the things that is supposedly known about Jesus is that he's from Nazareth. And the reasoning that Bart Ehrman gives is, who would make that up about somebody because it was a hillbilly hick town? But when you actually look at the historical evidence surrounding Nazareth and the attitudes towards Nazareth at that time and everything like that, it's kind of hard to actually support that argument. For one, like Nazareth was not like hillbilly hick town that just nobody cared about or whatever at the time. That seems to not be true. But also there's the prevalence of savior figures just like Jesus coming from small rural towns or whatnot. So it doesn't seem really out of the norm for, to make up a figure to come from some, small or no name town. But so, I mean, there's a lot of problems with just assuming that Nazareth is the location. Plus, you end up having to ignore the fact that the Gospels themselves tell us that the reason why he's from Nazareth is because the scriptures say that he's supposed to be from Nazareth.
Bingo.
Well, Matthew says
bingo. And there's other scriptures there's Mark had his scriptures that made it from Nazareth. Matthew had his scriptures that made it from Bethlehem. Other people could have been from Cana. There were all kinds of different exegesis they could point to say, oh no, the Messiah is going to come from this place here.
Well, Matthew and Luke go to great lengths to get him to be born in Bethlehem in some sense of the word. So it's clear that for those two writers, it was very important that he would be born from Bethlehem. So why then the dichotomy?
But I want to stop you there because, well, here's the thing. Like Hitchens made the same argument. Says the bullshit, the obvious forgery of it is telling that he must have really been born in Nazareth because they really, really wanted him to be born in Bethlehem. But all it means is that those guys knew that they had a scripture that said he has to be born in Bethlehem. Mark had scripture that said he had to be born in Nazareth. And that's all.
Could you tell me, maybe you don't remember off the top of your head, and that's fine. Where is it, like what prophecy is Mark? The only prophecy I'm aware of is the one that Matthew appeals to that we no longer have. He appeals to some prophecy that doesn't exist. Or maybe it exists for him, but doesn't exist in our sources.
And that is exactly true.
What about Mark? So I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay, I'm not talking about prophecy per se, but he chose Nazareth because Netzer, he wanted Jesus to be a Nazarene, not a Nazarite, not from Nazareth. If you read in my book, Jesus, Myth, and Action and Nailed, we talk about how for Mark never actually calls him Jesus of Nazareth. He uses it as a sect title, Jesus the Nazarene, which means something very different from somebody from Nazareth.
Okay, so how do we get from there to Matthew? Because Matthew definitely used Mark as a source. So,
right, yeah, Matthew did, Luke did. What I'm saying is, Mark actually doesn't say that Jesus is from Nazareth.
Okay, so Mark attributed him as part of this sect of Nazarenes because he had a reason for that. And Matthew misunderstood and said that he's from Nazareth because of that.
Well, I don't even know if he misunderstood or if he just didn't care. That wasn't important. I mean, the birth of Jesus doesn't happen in Mark's gospel at all. Mm-hmm. At all. There's no nativity. And later gospel writers like Matthew and Luke, they didn't like that. They wanted to have more information. None of them were setting out to write the gospel according to me or the gospel according to this other guy. All of them were setting out to write the one true gospel. And Luke even makes that explicitly clear. He says there's so many people writing gospels right now. It seemed to me a good idea to investigate the story and see what really happened according to the traditions handed down to our generation. And then he takes Matthew and Mark's story and basically uses it as the framework for
I've
his
always
own.
thought that was kind of amusing that Luke's almost like throwing shade on Mark, you know?
Totally. I mean, honestly, we're lucky we still have the Gospel of Mark, because both Matthew and Luke were writing to supplant it. John doesn't even really bother using it except for the basic storyline, and he doesn't have any problem switching things around and having Jesus crucified for completely different reasons than the Synoptic Gospels. And then there's Gospels like the Gospel of Peter, which we think is completely ridiculous because it has like a 500-foot tall Jesus coming out of the tomb and a talking cross. And yet, in its time, that gospel was so much more popular than Mark's. We have 3 times as many copies of that gospel as we do of the Gospel of Mark, and we're lucky to have it. Because
I'd go.
These guys were writing to supplant it.
I'd go with the cooler gospel too. Why not?
And I would
You got it.
like
I
to
mean, you know.
attack it from, I guess, because you guys are much smarter than I am, so I have to take a more simple route to this information. and that is, I was like this. So if the gospel, any accounts of the gospels are true or accurate, what are they, and why? Why are they dependable? Why can we depend on these accounts to solidify this Jesus claim? And I always tell people I follow the evidence or the lack of good evidence for Yahweh the same way I do Jesus. I'm looking for good evidence that will support the claim. So show me the account, and then also show me why this is trustworthy. And then they have to do all the talking.
Well,
right.
I mean,
right. And I want to make it super clear. There's nothing implausible about Jesus being a real dude.
Absolutely.
Nothing at all. It's just when we look at the evidence, we don't have good evidence for that. We have good evidence that the earliest Christians, before Mark wrote his gospel and all the other gospels that were based on it, they looked at Jesus a completely different way than Christians did after the gospels were written. And it was a celestial Messiah, like the book of Hebrews. He does everything up in the heavenly realm and nothing's happening on earth. But anyway, Jordan,
I was just going to say, I think historians would say that they've done that. You may not find what they've done compelling. But even if you throw out the Gospels entirely, you've got some indications of a physical Jesus in the writings of Paul and his references to James' brother, which I know Godless Engineer disagrees with me on, but that, and then also Josephus for the same reason. So we can get into. I don't want to dominate the conversation. I don't know if I'm the only person who thinks Jesus is actually real here.
Well, you know what? Actually, maybe we should put it back. What are the things you find most compelling about the historicist argument? Because, and this is the other thing I want to say, is like, it doesn't matter to us at the end of the day whether he was or wasn't. Because for me, all the back and forth between the mythicist side and the historicist side, just if at the end of the day, it shows us how little we can depend on anything, Christian right or wrong, whether Jesus is real or not. Our evidence for him is incredibly dodgy. And so I'm curious to know, what are the things you find most compelling about the historicist argument?
That's a good question. When I first was asked to look into this, I was talking to a Christian friend of mine about the reasons why I didn't believe in God, and he asked me what research I'd done into Jesus, and I had to admit, not much. So the first book I read was Carrier's book, and found it very persuasive and erudite. But then, as I try to be a good skeptic, and so I asked, like, well, why aren't the rest of historians persuaded by this? And so I looked into it, and the things that persuaded me most to come down against Carrier's position and the position of mythicists in general, I think the single strongest piece would be Josephus and Paul together referencing Jesus' brother, because if he didn't have a brother, if he had a brother, he has to be real, right? Then the combination, the historical plausibility of it, the fact that it is a small claim, that it is contextually credible, that there was a apocalyptic prophet, and then the various points or pieces of the gospel story that make it through the criteria that is used in the field. Contextual credibility, dissimilarity, multiple attestation, and embarrassment of that one's the weakest. Seemed to me to paint a picture of an apocalyptic prophet, which kind of fit nicely. And so briefly that would be, and then just kind of fundamentally, because I'm not a scholar, fundamentally for me as a skeptic, the fact that the vast and overwhelming majority of critical scholars is something I have to take into account, because I have to understand my own limitations, right? And so like if I was just going to guess at the outset who's going to be right, is it going to be me or some people who spent their entire lives researching it? I'd put my money on them, right? So yeah.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this. Do you think what percentage of Christian biblical scholars do you think are wrong about there being a real God?
The Christian ones? I think they're all incorrect because I'm an atheist.
Yeah.
But
and that's what I'm saying. I think Christian biblical scholars are as wrong about Jesus as they are about God, and for the same reason. Right. And not to toot my own horn, but if you've read the book Jesus, Mything in Action, I talk about all the consensus and the lack of consensus in biblical studies. And again, not to dominate the conversation, not to come to
dominate and then freeze.
We're trying to like piece together
Dragon said that Paul never said James was a brother of Jesus. He said he was a brother of the Lord. How do you feel about that?
Well, and I think that's a very important distinction to make, because Paul could have said, he's the brother of Jesus, and like that would have made it a lot more likely that he's talking about like a blood relative. But the fact that he's using this cultic title, the Lord, or even it's even a celestial title. I don't know concerning considering.
And he mentions.
Go ahead.
Oh no! Well, that we know that he mentions the brethren of the Lord as a separate group. Who he complains about. They get to bring sister wives with them, and we don't. But I think that one verse in Galatians where it mentions not the brother of Jesus, but the brother of the Lord, is probably the number one hook that historicists put their hat on. The Josephus thing, there's just no way. And I've got a whole chapter on both those mentions that it's like, I'm surprised that Christians are still using the argument, but I'm baffled that atheists are aping their arguments, because there's just no way those two disputed passages in Josephus hold up at all.
So I think it's a mistake to draw this line between as like Christians and atheists in the scholarship, at least, because it's not the case that like you've just got Christian scholars and then atheists like me who are listening to them. There's atheist scholars, agnostic scholars, Jewish scholars, particularly of Josephus. And so if it were the case that these arguments are so ridiculous and the only reason that these scholars are making them is because they're Christian, you would think at least that the Jews wouldn't be persuaded by it, right? Or the atheists or agnostics. It seems odd to me that you don't get it if it is in fact just bias.
So I think that it's poor reasoning to say, if an atheist is convinced by it, or an atheist believes it, then that means that it must be true, or that's reliable information that we get from these scholars. Keep in mind, though, that the group that you're talking about, the current consensus of that group is that, as a historical fact, Jesus resurrected from the dead. Like that is the consensus, thinking that Jesus did not historically resurrect from the dead as an act of God is a fringe position for that particular group. So it's really hard for me to not distinguish between that entire group and the ones that are within the group that are I guess atheist leaning or whatnot. Because even if all of the atheists that are biblical scholars or New Testament scholars or anything like that were to just suddenly flip to be a mythicist, it would still be a fringe position. it would still be looked down upon by quote unquote serious scholars. And I really can't, I have trouble taking somebody seriously that calls himself a historian, but yet they were trained by a seminary. So those are the kinds of things that make me doubt it, doubt the information that they're telling me. And I feel like I need to, figure out like what is the best information, because I don't feel like I'm getting the best information from that kind of scholar.
So, well,
let me just jump in and then I'll try to shut up for a little while and let everybody else talk. But I totally take your point, Jordan, that it shouldn't be just a Christians versus everybody else thing. And yet the preponderance of Christian influence in biblical studies, I mean, in Mything in Action, I talk about that a lot because Christian biases pervade biblical studies and always have. And it's not even a question of how many biblical scholars deny Jesus, but how many Christian scholars in the field of biblical studies, that subfield of history, are contractually required to toe the theological line, including dismissing mythicism. And that's an astounding number. And it's such a weird, bizarre situation that you don't see in any other field of history. And Philip Davies from Sheffield University, he was a historicist, and yet I agree with him so much on what he had to say about Bart Ehrman's "Did Jesus exist?" and the attitude about how this is ridiculous and shouldn't even be looked into. He says, surely the flimsy weight of Jesus should be weighed, and it wouldn't even be controversial in any other field of history to do that.
So, couple things. I'm trying to scroll back to everything that GE said too. I don't think it's the case that all scholars that are Christian were trained in seminary, or certainly not all scholars in relevant fields. I would agree with you that if somebody is contractually obligated to hold to a statement of faith, I would look askance at their research because they can't come to any other conclusion, right? So for those scholars, I could certainly understand wanting to pass them by.
This is the thing.
And so it would be persuasive to persuasive to me if I would be far more skeptical of the field as a whole if there was a stark disconnect between those kind of scholars and other scholars. And that's where I think Josephus, which I mentioned this to John, so this won't be new to him, but where I think Josephus scholars can kind of help as a compare-contrast thing, because they, by and large, are not trained in seminaries. They're mostly Jewish or secular. There are some that are Christian scholars too. But they also come to similar conclusions where their fields intersect. And you would think that if it were the case that, like the case for James' brother Jesus was so ridiculous that the only way you could get there is bias, you would think that they wouldn't get there because they have no incentive. Like, what does it matter to a Jewish scholar whether or not they think that portion of Josephus is authentic? What does it matter to them? I don't know that there'd be any pressure. And so now, just to be clear, that is not to say that they're correct, because they could all be wrong. They certainly could all be wrong. All I'm saying is that this is, to me, evidence that at least the field as a whole hasn't come to this conclusion purely through bias. And so it's still a useful heuristic to me as a layman. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And again, these aren't my closing arguments. These are my opening arguments. And we, reading the arguments against Josephus in Jesus Mything in Action, I just personally, I don't see how non-Christians are still using these arguments at all.
Can we mentioned this?
For me personally, it's like, for instance, I mean, for 300 years, Christian church fathers loved Josephus, but they complained, Origen, for instance, most famously, complained that he never mentions Jesus. Origen's copy of Josephus's work is what was passed down to Eusebius, the first guy to quote this Testimonium Flavinianum, and no one in Christianity quotes it again until Jerome. So we've got a 500-year spread where only one guy seems to know about this little commercial for Jesus that's tucked in this passage of Josephus.
Well,
anyway, that's the kind of thing that drives me crazy.
I wasn't talking
it's
about
ignored.
the Testimonium Flavianum. I was referencing later in Antiquities. For those who don't spend their free time reading Josephus, what we're talking about is Josephus was a Jewish scholar to the Romans, and he wrote a book called The Antiquities of the Jews. And in the context of writing about the Jews, a lot of people he thought were way more important than Jesus, if he mentioned him at all. He mentions Jesus arguably twice, once in the Testimonium Flavianum, which in its current state, as David said, is basically an advertisement for Jesus. And then later on, he mentions Jesus in the text we have in passing as a way of referencing Jesus' brother who was killed in a political struggle. There's a quick lesson for anybody who wasn't
mention
following.
that real fast. And just to tag onto that second story makes no sense whatsoever if it's really about anybody who is associated with the Jerusalem church, as Jacob, the brother of the Lord, was supposed to have been. But it makes perfect sense if the Jesus they're talking about is Jesus, son of Damnius, the son of the high priest, who the story actually mentions. Then it makes perfect sense.
So
I'll leave that there for now.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I don't want to. I don't want to.
It's all good stuff. It's all good stuff. You guys are doing great.
Yeah.
I did want to.
We'll both be quiet after this. And
I did want to bring up another question here from Dragons, though. He mentioned the brothers again. Paul also mentioned 500 other brothers of the Lord. How many kids did Mary have?
So on that, that was something that was asked before. I think it's important to keep track of the words being used by Paul. So Paul does use the term brother all over the place. This guy's a brother, that guy's a brother, this guy's like all over the place. He clearly, the term brother was used as a fictive kinship thing for Christians, much like Christians do today, right? What is the precise title, though, brother of the Lord, is only used twice in all of Paul's writings. You've got the one in Galatians, and then you've got the one in Corinthians. So the one in Galatians is the one where he meets this person, and the one in Corinthians is the one that you mentioned earlier, David, where he's complaining about not being able to bring wives, which I don't know why he's complaining, because he didn't think you should get married anyway, but whatever. It doesn't matter. He was complaining about it.
Right. Well, they were sister wives. Yeah, basically he's talking about housekeepers. Yeah, not icky girls that you would want to marry, because that's Paul's not into that.
So so anyway, the argument goes that this phrasing, brother of the Lord, is distinctive and separate from the other more general way of referring to brothers. And so because it's only used twice and only in context where it would make more sense to be about like distinguishing this Christian from other Christians, because if brother of the Lord simply means Christian.
Oh, wait.
Then
hold on.
Can I finish?
But when you say brethren of the Lord, but when you're saying brethren of the Lord, I mean, he's talking about a group of people.
So he's distinguishing some
it seems
subset.
To be a sect title.
He's distinguishing a subset of Christians. That set can include one or more, as all sets can include 0 or more than 0 members, if you prefer that terminology. So he's distinguishing a set of Christians from the larger set of Christians when he uses the term brother of the Lord. And the argument, which I personally find compelling, is that if brother of the Lord was simply a title used generically for Christians, then it wouldn't make much sense. Take the one in Galatians, because I think that's more illustrative. Okay. In that, it's Galatians 1:9, and he says, I'm trying to remember my Bible verse off the top of my head.
I mean, how if
don't even sweat it.
While you're looking for
it,
he says,
I didn't see any apostles. I only saw James, the brother of the Lord.
Right. So
I'm wondering,
talking about his trip to Jerusalem.
I'm wondering what the big difference is between brother of the Lord and brother in Christ. Because like the Lord in this context,
I think, let me just. I think we could be splitting that hair forever, but what I'd like to mention is, sticking with Galatians, if we just go a few verses later, when he's talking about his run-ins with the leadership of the Jerusalem church, including James, he's claiming that these guys are not real Christians. They've brought in false believers. He didn't give in to them for a second. He hates those guys. He doesn't think they're real Christians. And he says, I didn't give in to them for a minute. And when Peter came down, I opposed him to his face. It flabbergasts me that apologists can say, oh, look, here he's talking about the brother of the Lord. and then he treats the guys that we think of as Jesus' friends and family as their fake Christians. That makes no sense to me whatsoever.
I don't know why that would be problematic. I mean, if James was Jesus' brother, that doesn't mean that Paul would be obligated to agree with him. I mean, Paul thought he got the word directly from God, right? Paul thought that God appeared to him. You know, so like, why would it matter?
But I mean, well, for one thing, if the Jerusalem church was known to be Jesus's disciples, and by the way, Paul never calls any of those guys disciples. He never even uses the word disciple for anybody in any context ever. How could he possibly defend the fact that he opposes them if they're the real deal, if they're the 12? These are the things that make me wonder. We can go all through the Gospels, and there's weird things that don't make sense according to the historicist model. And we can say, well, maybe, but I mean, it's not like this is the only one thing. And the reason I get so worked up about it is that seems to be the brother of the Lord thing in Galatians seems to be the one constant that historicists taught. That's dodgy. And when you put all the other things out there, there's so many things that the reason Paul's even talking about it, the reason early Christians before the Gospels are even talking about it that way, why would they say these things this way if the story is the way it's always been presented to us in Sunday school? The Christians before the Gospel's written act and talk about Jesus completely different than Christians do after the Gospels are written.
To be clear, I don't think it's the story is like we were taught in Sunday school. I am an atheist. But I just wanted to speak.
No, but I mean, and I take your point. And again, like I said, there's nothing implausible about there being a guy named Jesus. But when we look at the hooks that the historicist arguments are hang on, they become fewer and fewer, and all of them are a little dodgy. None of them, there's no smoking guns on the historicist side.
What about?
And they act as if it's a done deal already.
What about Eusebius? Dragon says he was criticized during his life for forgeries and wrote an entire chapter defending the practice of lying for Jesus. Is this true?
Yep.
So can we trust Eusebius?
No.
Well, this is the same guy who gave us the story of. This is the same guy who gave us the story of Constantine seeing the cross in the sky, and that's what converted him to Christianity. Only it wasn't really a cross; it was the Cairo, which was also a pagan symbol. And he never told that story during Constantine's life. He's told 5 different versions of it, but that version came after Constantine's death. There are many, many, many reasons why Eusebius is a big fat liar, and we can point to them.
Are you saying Constantine wasn't Christian?
Again, I apologize because I get on a roll when we talk about these topics, and I don't want to dominate the conversation. So let me just.
Well, how do you feel about that, Jordan?
I'm not going to get into whether or not Constantine was a Christian because that's not the point of the conversation.
Eusebius. Was Eusebius a liar?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know. I haven't heard that particular accusation, so I can't speak to it. I don't want to speak outside of my own reading.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I don't remember where the exact quote is, but I can possibly find it and post it in the comments after tomorrow. But Eusebius does say that it is virtuous to lie in order to promote Christianity.
To be fair, that's a chapter heading that was probably not written by him.
Oh, really?
But clearly his actions speak louder than that one particular quote. People fixate on that quote, but that's not why we say he's a big liar.
The idea that Christians would write forgeries for what they saw was virtuous aims is clearly true because a large proportion of the New Testament is forged. Ironically, some of those forgers chastise people forging documents in their forgeries, which is
right.
So
Absolutely.
it's clear that at least some Christians at some point
such good work on that.
It's clear that at least some Christians at some point thought that writing a forgery was permissible for whatever reason. So that I would have. I mean, that's obvious.
Absolutely.
And Paul also indicates that lying for the Lord is the glory for the glory of God.
Well, I think lying for Jesus has enjoyed a popular tradition from the very beginning to today.
Of course, then Paul goes, but I'm not lying.
Not this time. Not this one thing.
I'm not lying. They're lying.
He was accused of being a liar.
If I can ask this here, because I think this plays into it. But so if whether you're a Christian or not, and you take the historical position, and whether we're saying it's the we'll just use the Gospels because we already talked about the Gospels. If we're saying that there is even a shred of historical reliability there, and we're going to depend on that, then that means those are the books that give us the most detail as far as the virgin birth all the way up through the resurrection, right? And if that's the case, why are we going to concede, or why are we going to walk away from the divinity? Why are we going to walk away from the miracles and only argue for, or try to, the best we can cement this Jesus character? Because, like it was brought up earlier, once we parcel off, or we detach the divinity and the miracles from Jesus, we're no longer talking about the Jesus of the Bible. We're talking about a whole another person, because that is who that book claims that he was. So why argue anything different if it's worthless? Because now the crux, the linchpin of the religion, of the doctrine, of the theology falls apart as soon as you strip away the divinity and the miraculous from Jesus. So why even argue for that?
Well,
truth.
In antiquity, people did magic all the time. If you listen to people who were writing, there are certain Roman emperors, Vespasian, for example, who were said to have healed the sick and things like that. But that doesn't mean he didn't exist. So I think it would be too hasty to say this person has implausible magical things attached to them, therefore they don't exist, or we strip that away and they don't exist, because that's just like how ancient people talked and thought,
But that's not what I'm saying. Is it's not the Jesus of the Bible. There may be a dude named Jesus, and there could have been a dude walking around, which does not matter to me. That's irrelevant, because I wasn't taught for 30 plus years that there was a dude named Jesus. I was taught and indoctrinated that there's this dude named Jesus that is the savior of the world, Emmanuel, the second coming, the propitiation of our sin, yada yada yada. So I don't care about the dude necessarily, but it's when we strip away the divine from the dude, we're not talking about the guy in that book anymore.
I mean, if you define, like, just I think it's a little bit of semantics. Like, if you said, in order to be a historicist, you'd have to agree with the divine miracles thing, then I guess I'm a mythicist then, because I definitely don't agree in that stuff. No.
If I could play devil's advocate a little bit here, I don't subscribe to throwing out the Gospels as not historical sources. I think that, in my opinion, I've left myself open to the idea that there could be historical kernels in the Gospels. Where I get hung up though is that it's like, what kind of criteria can we actually use to sift through the mythical and legendary from the historical? And I think that the quality of the Gospels are just so poor that we can't do that.
Trash
is where. Well, yeah. Well, that's where I stand. But I guess I'm in a little bit of agreement with Jordan here, because I don't think that we should throw out the Gospels, completely as if they couldn't provide us with any kind of information. I just think that the information that could be historical is so diluted to the point where we simply can't know. Like, there's no way for us to actually determine, well, is Nazareth really his birthplace, or is Matthew, writing about 10 years or so after Mark, just, enlightening us as to where Mark got his information from? Because it's pretty obvious that between Paul's writing, or when Paul turned into a Christian, and Mark writing, people figured out or thought about Jesus's birthplace And the only birthplace that came up first was Nazareth. And then we've got Matthew saying, oh, well, there's this scripture that says that he's supposed to be called a Nazarene or be from Nazareth or whatever. So, I mean, it's very obvious to me that like there's an equally plausible explanation for everything that could be considered a core historical fact about Jesus. There's an equally likely explanation that doesn't require Jesus to have existed. So it seems superfluous. And that's not me throwing out the Gospels as evidence. That's just me being critical of the Gospels and not just what I imagine is people just throwing their hands up in the air and saying, oh, well, that must be historical, without actually providing any kind of evidence as to why it would be historical. It's just kind of presumed to be historical because that's the easiest option.
I think we're more on par there than we realize, because I'm saying, okay, if we do grant that there is some type of historical or any historical accuracy that we can take away from the Gospels, and they are accurate, is it just only 50% of it's accurate and the rest is bullshit, or is it 25% accurate and the rest is bullshit? Because it's either it's dependable or it's not, and either this guy was walking on water and spitting in mud and dirt and healing people's blind eyes, or where, at what point is it not reliable anymore?
No, I agree with you. Sorry, George. I'll let you go here in 1 second.
That's a great question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you, and what I'm saying is that we can't know, like, unless we find new information that elucidates the filter for the Gospels, we're just simply never going to know, and that's why they're not useful as historical sources. I do see in the comments on the live stream, though, that J Mike, who's a great creator, by the way, he says multiple attestation. But the problem is that we don't have multiple attestation of this. We have one author that's being copied three times.
Exactly.
And so that just means that we have and more. And so that just means that we have one person that's claiming either for one reason or another that Jesus is from Nazareth. Paul has no idea or care about Jesus's like origin story. So it seems to me like the multiple attestation bit is really hinging on one gospel and then Paul's work. But we already know that there's strong support showing that Mark, the author of Mark, knew Paul's epistles. So really, we just have one source, and that source doesn't even mention Nazareth as a birthplace. Doesn't mention a birthplace at all. Doesn't mention, the Epiphany. It doesn't mention anything. It just mentions that Jesus is dead and he's appearing to people afterwards, and that's it.
And the two birth narratives that we do have, Matthew and Luke, which came later, they don't agree with each other at any point. None of those stories can match up, and yet somehow elementary schools do the mashup of the Christmas play, and we all see the shepherds and the wise men in the same room, but the stories, when you read them, there is no point where those things could match up at all.
Impossible. Basically,
Jordan, go ahead. Okay. We got one more question. Go ahead, Jordan.
Basically, the only point they agree on is that he was born in some sense in Bethlehem, because that's the point of the stories.
That brings me to the next question here from Materialistic Dan.
Well, actually, no, they don't even agree that. Yeah. Never mind. Go ahead.
Under the mythicist hypothesis, how would you explain the difficulty that exists within the Gospels to make the life of Jesus fit prophecies? Would not an invented person better fit the prophecies?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting if you divide the prophecies into bullshit prophecies we've never been able to find the prophecies that are obviously being, having an invented person fulfill them. The whole argument from prophecy that we get from apologists just weakens itself just by pointing at them. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I agree that details of Jesus' life were almost certainly doctored by later writers who were aware of prophecies and wanted to make sure that Jesus fit them. So I don't think that the argument from the fact that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, and the only way we know about it is the writings of the guy who tells us that he fulfilled the prophecy, I think the point that he's making is that the gospel writers seem to contort and twist to make sure that this Jesus character fits the prophecies in such a way that they wouldn't have to if they were free to just make up whatever they wanted.
Well, no. I disagree with that, because you have to.
Same here.
Right. Well, because you have to understand the Gospels were writing for the communities that they existed within. So it's not that these writers are just randomly taking prophecies out of the Old Testament and creating a story out of them. These were the prophecies that their particular groups believed were true about the Messiah. And so their task is creating this narrative that fulfills these prophecies, that shows that he's, the Messiah of God or whatever. And he's more importantly, he's the Jewish Messiah. So he's better than all these other, saviors that are going around out there that proclaim to give eternal life and who baptize you in water and all this other stuff. Like, this is Jesus, this is the Jewish Messiah guy. So these represent distinct groups. That's why, like in Matthew and Luke, you have different biblical genealogies. They're totally different, and they represent at least two distinctly different communities that had different ideas about Jesus's lineage. But not only that, you had two communities that both needed an earthly, like, Davidic connection, between Jesus and his lineage. But then you also needed the whole pagan concept of God impregnating a woman on earth and giving birth to himself, essentially, or giving birth to a demigod, really. And so you have this interesting mix of people in those groups that require one part of it requires a Jewish lineage. Another part of it requires God to forcefully impregnate a 14-year-old child, as far as people understand Mary's age to be. So I mean, you have these two groups, and so they're trying to weave this forward-facing idea, because early Christianity was just a mystery cult. And the Gospels reinforce this. So you have these outward-facing stories that are earthly tales of Jesus, but then the internal stories are of the celestial Jesus and all this other stuff. That's just how a mystery cult works. So the reason why they created these different stories and everything like that, well, it's because of the area that they were in, the kind of religion they were developing. That was just part of what it meant to be a mystery cult at that time, and that's exactly what they were.
I disagree with the characterization of early Christianity as a mystery cult. They have some superficial like similarities, and they were certainly in a context where mystery cults existed, but I don't know that classifying the earliest forms of Christianity as a mystery cult is necessarily accurate.
Say more about that, Jordan, because that's a baffling statement to me.
Okay, so I'm not sure why it's
because
baffling.
when you have somebody like Paul using mystery terminology, and when you have Jesus saying things like in the Gospel of Mark that right out of the gate in Mark 4, I believe it is, he's saying to his disciples, "Now I teach in parables so that those outside of us won't understand. Otherwise, they would turn from their sins and be saved. I'm telling you, my cognoscenti, my inside group, that's pure mystery faith, deity talk. And the fact that that's still in our Bibles blows my mind, because it makes no sense for our familiar Jesus who came here to save us all to say, oh, no, that's why I'm doing this, is so that only the guys who are in the club can get saved. Well, and not to mention everything we see about the way Paul presents his gospel, including calling it a mystery, and the Lord's Supper, a mystery faith ritual. I mean, these are all right out of the mystery faith.
So religions have rituals. I don't think the fact that mystery cults have rituals and Christianity's rituals, therefore it's a mystery cult, I don't think that's a particularly compelling piece of evidence. They both have rituals that happen to involve food. I don't think that line of argument is very compelling, at least not to me. But while there are some mystery type language that is used, there's more to being a mystery cult than that. Most importantly, it has to be secretive, right? And because it's a mystery, it's like a secret club, like the Freemasons would be today. And
I mean, they were.
So what you can say that I'm going to need some evidence for that, because what I see is
Mark's gospel.
What I see is a religion that was extremely about proselytizing. They were about bringing in new members. They were about that. It wasn't the fact that they had this like. They weren't trying to hide their teachings. It didn't seem anyway from the evidence we have. It seemed like they were shouting it at the counter on the corners, right? Now they weren't super popular at first, but that doesn't seem to strike me as a mystery cult.
Hey Jordan, if I could just because I don't know how much time we have, and I'm ADHD, so you may have answered, and I completely forgot already. But I did want to get an answer from you on why are we worried whether it's historically if there is a historical Jesus, if it does not also have the divine attached to it? Why is that character important?
Well, I mean, I think it's an important historical question. It sure would be nice to know. Jesus is, whether he was real or not, is one of the most influential figures of Western history. And so details about his life I find interesting just as a historical question. Does it matter to me, like in some kind of existential way? I mean, no.
Let's search for truth.
If I can really quick, as far as like the early Christianity being a mystery religion and having like the secrets and everything like that, let me read from you Mark 4 starting at verse 10. It says, when he was done, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing, but never perceiving, and ever hearing, but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. So, I mean, Mark is explicitly writing right here, fabricating something about Jesus in history that's explaining how Christians that are not indoctrinated, but inducted into the faith, they have the secret of the kingdom of God. And everybody on the outside that they're preaching to, the uninducted, the non-inducted, they see everything in parables. And so, I mean, this is the exact kind of evidence that you were just asking for. Now, we're not going to find evidence of Paul being like, hey, guys, we're going to set up a mystery religion here, okay? It's going to be great. We're going to make a lot of money. We're going to get fed. I mean, we can sleep wherever we want to. You're not going to find that. But what you are going to find are places like this in the Gospels and in Paul's epistles that talk about how there's a secret, that those that are not inducted will not be given the secret. Those that are not inducted will see these forward-facing stories as these lessons and everything like that. But once they're inducted, they'll be given the secret. Or once somebody's inducted, they'll be given the secret.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to just jump in really quick.
I'm so sorry you haven't had a chance to talk.
No, I'm sorry I haven't jumped in sooner. This is a newer topic to me that I have been listening to a lot of online, and I've enjoyed this conversation. You guys are all brilliant, by the way, and I have had some technical difficulties tonight, so I've been a little flustered. But I do have to leave because I'm going out for my anniversary dinner. So I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to just say if there's any final thoughts, I don't want to end the conversation necessarily if you guys wanted to go, but I don't know what everyone's time frame is like. But I also didn't want to just pop on and say hello and goodbye.
I was curious, Stacey, before you go, was there much mythicism in the church, since you're like the most recent deconvert here?
You know what? This was all brand new to me. Like this is all brand new as far as coming out of Christianity, this idea. So no. Hearing of Jesus, no, but it's
not even a thing,
fascinating.
right? Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
And so learning about this is absolutely fascinating, and it's something that I've been diving into. I haven't had a lot to interject because I'm learning so much. When I did hear about it from like Richard Carrier and just like the different like mystery cults and hearing it from that kind of perspective, it's so fascinating. So I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and like I said, I didn't interject because I don't feel like this is my expertise necessarily. I've just listened and enjoyed everyone's perspective, and I want to read your book, David. So yeah, I think I was thinking I got to add this to my to my library, and
also available on Audible.
Perfect.
Yes. Go ahead, David.
Well, I was going to say, Nailed is sort of the introduction to why the official story of Christianity doesn't hold up. But Jesus Mything in Action is the book I wrote in response to the atheist critics who said, oh, yeah, we know there wasn't a guy, like he wasn't the son of God, but there was a guy named Jesus. And I would love to get Jordan's take on that book when he reads it, because, again, Jordan is not my enemy. Historicists are not the enemy. Bullshit is the enemy. And the thing I love about this debate, and the thing that makes me so passionate about it, is that no matter whether Jordan's side and the historicist side comes out on top, or whether the mythicist side comes out on top, either way, our Jesuses debunk the Jesus of faith.
Yes.
And so I don't like having this conversation with Christians because it's such a conversation ender. But I love having it with atheists because everything we learn in the back and forth shows us, if nothing else, our evidence for Jesus, whether he existed or not, whether Christianity is even true or not, is super dodgy and much dodgier than apologists would have us believe.
Absolutely.
And you could say the same thing about Moses 30 years ago. 30 years ago, nobody was doubting Moses and the patriarchs and even David and Solomon. But now that's the consensus, that Moses didn't exist, that the Exodus didn't exist, that the conquest of Canaanite, that just did not happen historically. And that's not even controversial. Same thing with Jesus, in my humble opinion. Though you can give a lot of wiggle room, but when you take out Jesus, that's kind of it for Christianity. So I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think, I think John, you already said it, that this is always going to be a fringe position in biblical scholarship, and I could not agree more.
But I'll just say real quick, it was nice to meet you. Have a great dinner, and also I'm Godless Engineers. He doesn't know this. I'm his unofficial official hype man spokesman for Crestus, his app. I talk about it any opportunity I have. Go get that, and there's like a shitload of information that you need on that app. So,
closing arguments. Last words. Anybody?
Well, thanks
Jordan,
for having me. As the token historicist, I guess that's I didn't know that was my role coming in, but that's fine. I'm comfortable with being outnumbered. I am an atheist, but first and foremost, I'm a skeptic. If I were shown evidence that God existed, I would stop being an atheist. I wouldn't stop being a skeptic. And so when it comes to this position or any position, I think it's extremely important if you're researching it, particularly if you're a layman. It's very easy as a layman to fall into pitfalls. You don't know what you don't know. And so I am a layman. So my recommendation to anyone listening would be to check what I have to say, make sure that I'm correct. Read, Richard Carrier, read David's book, but then, and this is extremely, extremely important, go read the rest of literature, because the vast and overwhelming majority of critical scholars disagree. The people who spend their entire lives studying this one thing disagree. So as skeptics, we should naturally ask, well, why? What did they know that I don't? Maybe they're all wrong. That's possible, and we need to accept that as a possibility, but we owe it to ourselves as skeptics to find out why.
Where can we find your stuff,
I want
Jordan?
to say one last thing. Just to dovetail on what Jordan just said.
Go ahead.
I agree with everything he just said. The one thing I want to say is that as mythicists, at least for the ones that we take seriously, there's lots of fringe mythicists we don't have any truck with. We agree with most of what biblical scholars are saying. We agree with the synoptic problem. We agree with Markan priority. On point after point after point, we agree with them. We're not some pariah out there. We are in total agreement. We just take our conclusion a little further than most of them do. And we're much more alike than we are different.
In terms of where you can find me,
thank you, David.
We have a YouTube channel. It's reasoned out just there. You see on the screen. If you find a talented group of hip hop artists, we're not them. We have a very similar name, but it's not them. You can also find us on Twitter, pressx_to-doubt. We talk. I have a co-host, Jared, who's a former theologian. He went through seminary and realized I don't believe any of this. Turns out I'm an atheist.
Wow.
So we tackle Jesus mythicism, but basically skepticism as a whole. So not just religious things, but anything where you can apply skepticism.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Logan, where can we find your stuff? Closing argument, last words?
Well, I just have a small YouTube channel called The Uncarved Block, and I've just started it, and I have a few things on there. I actually went over a interview with Derek. What's his name? You got to know him, Derek
Lambert.
Derek Lambert. When he interviewed James McGrath, and I went through their video and made some comments, and that got my most hits. So I was so happy. I would say just very quickly that I was also a historicist. I was a theist still. I wasn't a Christian, but I went and I kept seeing Earl Daugherty's name pop up. And I finally went to Earl Daugherty's page, and I spent a year going over his entire page, trying to verify everything I could that he said. Then I read his book, and I actually had cognitive dissonance. Even though I wasn't a Christian, Jesus was still important to me. My wife is a Christian, and it upset me. This was not an easy decision for me to make. So, this isn't always just an easy blithe thing that we toss off. I would recommend Earl Daugherty's work. You can find Jesus Puzzle, Earl Daugherty. You'll find it. I think tonight his name hasn't been brought up, but he's very important. He got Richard Carrier started. And I was reading today his 20 silences in the epistles, and they're just amazing to read. And I was hoping to bring one up tonight, but we didn't get to it. And so, yeah, I would more focus instead of the Gospels. When I would discuss this, I would want to focus more on the epistles and things that are in the Gospels that should be brought up in the epistles and aren't. I think that's a stronger argument than the Gospels, because if we can look at what the Gospels actually say and what they don't say, then I think we can tell what was made up in the Gospels.
Sounds like a part 2.
Yeah, let's do it.
David, where can we find your stuff and closing arguments, last words?
Well, first of all, I want to apologize for jumping on Jordan. I hadn't realized he stopped talking before I jumped in. It's like, oh.
You're good.
It's been a little glitchy tonight.
Yeah.
It's been a little glitchy tonight, and I apologize for that. You can find me on davidfitzgerald.org. Most people find me on Facebook. And you can always send me an email at everybodylovesdave@gmail.com. And I haven't got a chance to plug the book I'm working on right now, but I'm super, super excited about it. And it's not just about Jesus mythicism, but it's about all the other major world religions, their world leaders, their founder figures, how many of them are also mythical? And the answer is more than you would think. And I'm very, very excited about that book.
Oh, I think a lot. So, man, holy cow, I'm excited about that one. Thank you. Godless Engineer, where can we find your stuff? Closing arguments, last words?
Yeah. So, fun fact, I don't know if many people know this, but I actually did the cover art for the 3 Jesus and Mything in Action books. Wow. And I had helped David out with that. So I was really happy to do that. I name drop you every time I can there, David. Also, my wife, Casey, wants to say hi. I didn't get a chance to before we went live. But I thought I'd tell you that right now. As far as closing arguments go, I stand with Jordan here because I know that he's kind of outnumbered, and I didn't mean for that to happen. But
Same.
I do want to stand with Jordan here and say that you need to read both sides. of the argument. Like, I don't think that you need to only read mythicist, stuff, or and I definitely don't think you only need to read historicist stuff. But I think that if you read both and you compare the evidence that is presented in the academic positions, which, to be fair, and not just because I'm on the mythicist side, but to be fair, there's not a comprehensive academically published like historicist defense out there. The closest you can get is Bart Ehrman's "Did Jesus Exist?" and that's a pop level book, so it's not academically supported, and there's a lot of problems with it in my opinion. But I think that people should read it just to see what the I guess the best defense of the historical position is, which I think that currently right now that probably stands as like one of the better things, although it was a little tough for me to get. Yeah, it was a little tough for me to get through the first chapter, to be honest. But
let me just jump in. We're huge Bart Ehrman fans. Read, Jesus Interrupted. Read the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. Read Forgery and Counterforgery in Christianity. His work is stellar, and I feel like I've said this before that for such a staunch historicist, he's one of the best mythicist scholars out there, because he's done more to pull the curtain on biblical scholarship problems and just the textual problems of the New Testament than just about anybody else.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I I'm not, I know that probably a lot of people see me as the enemy, or that I'm an idiot or something like that, just because I'm a mythicist, and that's perfectly fine. But it's not my goal to make people into like you have to be on this side or that side. I mean, exactly. This is literally a disagreement over an opinion. And that's what a lot of things are in history, actually. Like, I mean, as far as like the history that we're doing, like ancient history, a lot of it is opinion, and opinion can change. And that's why having discussions like, the one that we're doing tonight, and, having all the different positions being, debated in academia. I mean, I think that that's very important. And so while I'm not convinced of the historical position, given the evidence that they provide, that doesn't mean that I think that it's just ridiculous to think he was a historical person, or I'm so far on the mythicist side that I'm not willing to like honestly investigate the question, because I'm always just like with the God question or any other question that we have in this particular niche of the internet. I'm very open to being proven wrong if there's good evidence to suggest that I am. And I highly implore everybody to have that position as well. Read Bart Ehrman's work. Read all the scholarship of the consensus of the field. Read it and just look at the evidence that they provide, and then compare it, honestly with the mythicist position, because I've seen
and
so
watch
many
where
people,
that consensus breaks down. Also,
right. Watch what happens when people. Well, I was going to say, and this is where David FItzgerald's Jesus Mything in Action really comes into importance here. Look at the reactions of that community when somebody even slightly steps out of line. When somebody slightly strays from that mainstream Christian line. I mean, like it. Yeah. It could literally be, hey,
and we're talking Christian scholars here. We're talking Christian scholars, not atheists at this point. Yeah,
right. Like if somebody just simply says, hey, zombies didn't walk in Jerusalem after Jesus died, they will literally, blacklist you and fire you from positions. And
ask Michael Wiseman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's been there's a similar pushback against mythicism as there was for proving that the patriarchs of the Old Testament didn't exist. So just read everything and then come to a conclusion. I stand with Jordan on this. I'm right there with you. And be kind to one another in this conversation, because many so many people are just harsh towards one another. I think that we just need to realize that we're having a conversation. We disagree on it, and that's it, and that's okay.
Perfectly fine.
That's my end argument right there.
I love
you mentioned a couple of Bart Ehrman's works. If I was going to recommend one to someone who's just like just getting started in this sort of thing, if you haven't done a lot of research into it, I'd recommend his great courses, which you can get through Audible. He does an audiobook, The Historical Jesus, because what it does is it goes through like the sort of mainstream historical view, how they got there. It's still a popular level work, but it's a nice overview to get you started as a jumping off point, so you like understand the terms and stuff like that. It was helpful to me.
His Jesus Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium also gives a really good feel for where he's coming from and what arguments he uses to back them up, which I love his transparency about that. That's one thing I've always admired about him.
And,
lots of good books out there.
And for people that may not have money, a lot of time your libraries have access to Audible. So
absolutely.
And ask your library to carry these books. That's another thing we can do.
That as well.
Yeah,
that as well. Thanks, guys.
Oz.
Sorry,
Oz. I hate to interrupt. Casey pointed out in the chat that I was asked, where can people find you? And people still don't know. So good point there, honey. On YouTube, I'm Godless Engineer. Pretty much any social media, I'm Godless Engineer. I also have an app that I'm constantly trying to actually get updated called Crestus, and they flash the URL on the screen, but you just go to there you go, crest.us, which, by the way, I don't know if you guys know it, but you've got to publicly list like your phone number and stuff and your email address for .us account. So I get like spam calls galore and texts. But anyways, that's got a lot of great information in it. It provides you with the historicist argument, and then of course the mythicist argument against that. So even if you're a historicist, it's still a good resource, because you can look at, what is the opposition saying, or what are the arguments for historical Jesus. That's still a very good resource to use. So definitely check that out. And, tomorrow I've actually got some mythicist content going out, which is going to be addressing a certain TikToker. So I hope that, people will join me then.
Awesome. Yeah. Check that out. Crest.us. Thank you for that. Oz, where can we find you? Closing arguments, last words.
Is it on?
It is on.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me. I love this conversation. And I will piggyback on what Godless Engineer said. Fucking be nice to each other. Like we don't need to be out here slitting each other's throats. Can we all just get along? Anyway, closing remarks or statements. I would agree again with what Jordan said. Be skeptical, whether it's the Jesus, the Yahweh, the Allah, the assalamu alaikums, like whatever it is. Like, be skeptical, ask all the questions, do the research, and do the right thing. And as far as being skeptical and question and examine and study both sides of the argument, and don't be that person who's biased and you're already pursuing the things that you want to agree with, that you need to confirm your argument, because that's not healthy. That's not healthy. You're not going to land. You're not going to land in the best position possible. But as far as the actual argument, again, I think I take a little. I guess it's the same thing, but to me, it just feels more simple. And it's just, what evidence do I have for Yahweh? What evidence do I have for Allah? What evidence? And I've tried to do the best I can to follow it on both sides for this Jesus character, just like I did with the God claims, and I still find myself being empty-handed. That I don't find convincing evidence. I don't find good evidence to support that this guy was here. Was who he's attributed to be in that book. But as far as where you can find me, Jen and I run the Atheist Network group, T.A.N.G. Gang. You can come hang out with us anytime you want, and we kind of do a little bit of everything. We do have mythicist conversations on there. We'll have everything from that. We focus a lot on mental health and taking care of ourselves and each other. And actually, we're on a week-long ban or whatever on YouTube because I DJ and somebody hit me with a strike, so we have to wait another 4 days. So I won't be DJing on there anymore. But it's literally, we do a little bit of everything. We have fun and we can be serious. So come check us out.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for the people in the chat. Everybody. Oh, thanks for the patrons. Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Bryce, Deborah Gray, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for stopping by. That's all the show there is for you today. We'll see you next time.